Brandon and Brian Carter had only been 16 for 3 weeks when their father signed them up at the Iron Path Karate Academy. They were quiet boys, respectful and serious, raised in a household where hard work wasn't a suggestion, it was the law. Their father, Henry Carter, a veteran with broad shoulders and hands scarred from years of construction work, believed martial arts would teach his sons discipline, confidence, and respect. What none of them knew was that beneath the polished floors of that dojo lay a sickness, a quiet venom that no belt color could hide. From the first day, the twins realized they stood out. Not because they were new, not because they were young, but because they were black boys in a place built on old money and older prejudices. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The Iron Path was famous in Milltown. Parents paid thousands every year for Sensei Robert Mason's guidance. Trophies lined the mirrored walls, and framed photos of smiling students in crisp white uniforms hung above polished wood floors. It looked clean, safe, honorable. But behind those bright lights lurked something uglier. The older students, boys like Ethan Myers and Colin Brooks, wore their black belts like crowns, using their seniority to control the room with whispers and mocking laughter. On that first evening, while Brandon and Brian bowed respectfully, Ethan leaned against the wall, smirking. "Fresh meat," he muttered to Colin, loud enough for others to hear. Brandon heard. So did Brian. Their father stood at the window, unaware. That night, after the first awkward class ended, the twins walked home in silence. Their father drove beside them in his truck, watching with the protective caution of a man who'd seen too much violence in too many dusty corners of the world. "How was it?" he called out. "Fine," Brian said, wiping sweat from his brow. Brandon forced a grin. "Yeah, Dad, fine." Neither believed the lie. Within days, the harassment began. Ethan's jokes shifted from harmless teasing to sharp-edged insults. He mocked their stances, called them monkeys when Sensei wasn't listening, and told them maybe basketball was more their style. "Stick to what you people do best," he'd whisper with a grin that made Brandon's blood boil. But they endured. Henry Carter had taught his sons that real men held the line, never cracked first, and never showed weakness. So they took it, each session leaving with more bruises and more questions. Sensei Mason never seemed to notice. He'd walk past as Ethan landed kicks just a little too hard, or when Colin swept Brian's legs out and whispered, "Back on the floor where you belong." Brandon's ribs ached at night. Brian nursed split lips. Still, they said nothing to their father. Henry came home tired from 16-hour shifts, his skin darkened by sun and dust, his shoulders slumping only after the front door closed. The boys couldn't bring him one more burden. But one night, after Brian staggered into the house with his uniform torn and a dark bruise blooming across his side, Henry's eyes narrowed. He asked no questions, just helped his son to the kitchen table and set an ice pack against the swelling. "You boys learning to fight," he said quietly, "or learning to take a beating?" Brian couldn't meet his eyes. Brandon's hands clenched into fists. They hadn't come to the dojo to start a war, but the war had found them. And deep in his bones, Brandon knew it wouldn't stop on its own. Something had to break. He just didn't know yet if it would be them, or the boys who thought they owned that bright polished room where respect was just a word on the wall. Brandon and Brian Carter returned to the Iron Path Karate Academy the next evening, with stiff shoulders and a determination that was already beginning to crack beneath the surface. Their father's words the night before echoed in Brandon's head. "You boys learning to fight or learning to take a beating?" He didn't have an answer then. He wasn't sure he had one now. Sensei Robert Mason greeted them at the door with his trademark half-smile, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and the calm demeanor of someone used to wielding absolute authority. He barely looked at the twins as they bowed, his eyes scanning the room as older students filed in, chatting and laughing, tugging on gloves and adjusting their belts. On the polished floor, the twins stood out. Two black boys surrounded by white uniforms and white faces. Ethan Myers swaggered past them on his way to the gear rack, bumping Brandon's shoulder hard enough to jolt him off balance. "Careful, rookie," Ethan sneered. "Wouldn't want you to trip over your own feet." Colin Brooks snickered behind him, his voice low but sharp. Maybe they should go play basketball instead. Leave the real fighting to real martial artists. Brandon gritted his teeth, feeling his brother's silent tension beside him. Their father had taught them patience, restraint, the power of keeping your chin high when someone tried to drag it down into the dirt. But patience was starting to feel like surrender, and the words burned in his chest. "Line up," Sensei Mason barked, clapping his hands twice. The chatter fell away. Students scrambled into formation according to rank, black belts in front, the rainbow of lower ranks behind them. Brandon and Brian shuffled to their place among the newest white and yellow belts. Brandon felt the eyes on them, some curious, some dismissive, a few downright hostile. "Tonight, we focus on defensive combinations," Mason announced, pacing the polished wood with his hands behind his back. "It's not enough to strike, you must learn to protect yourselves, control your space, control your opponent." Brandon swallowed hard. "Control your space," he thought bitterly, glancing at Ethan and Colin in the front row. Those two controlled every inch of this room already. They spent the first 20 minutes running drills. Basic blocks, stance adjustments, footwork. Brandon could feel Ethan's gaze boring into the back of his neck. Every time he moved, he wondered if he looked clumsy, weak. Beside him, Brian mirrored every step. His jaw clenched so tight Brandon worried his brother would crack a tooth. When Mason announced sparring rotation, the twins exchanged a nervous glance. Last time, Ethan and Colin had made sure they ended up with each other. Two older, stronger black belts against two new kids just learning to balance their weight on the mat. "Partner with someone near your level," Mason called out. But Ethan was already moving toward them, his grin wide and predatory. Colin followed like a shadow. "Look who it is," Ethan said, voice dripping with mock affection. "You two ready for a lesson in real karate tonight?" Brandon tried to step around him, searching for another yellow belt. "We should." "Should what?" Colin cut in, stepping close enough that Brandon could smell the mint gum on his breath. "Should find someone else?" "Nah, you're with us." Sensei Mason's voice carried across the room. "If you've got a partner, boo, and begin." Brian's hand brushed Brandon's. It was a small thing, but it grounded him, reminded him they were in this together. They bowed stiffly to their opponents, never breaking eye contact. "Light contact only," Mason said to the room. "Control is more important than power." Ethan's smirk widened. "Oh, we'll be real careful," he said softly, just for Brandon. The first round started fast. Ethan launched a jab that snapped Brandon's head back before he could raise his guard. Brandon tasted blood immediately, copper and salt on his tongue. He blinked, his vision swimming. Ethan's foot swept his legs, sending him sprawling. "Too slow," Ethan said, leaning over him. "Gotta keep those hands up, rookie." Brandon pushed himself to his feet, rage coiling in his gut. On the next exchange, he tried to counter with a weak punch, but Ethan stepped aside and slammed a palm into his chest, knocking the wind from him again. Across the mat, he heard Brian grunt as Colin drove a knee into his ribs. "Breathe," Brian gasped, eyes watering, trying to regain his footing. But Colin was relentless, sweeping his legs and dropping him hard on the mat with a crack that made Brandon's stomach turn. "Up," Colin barked. "Again!" Sensei Mason stood across the room, watching another pair of students with forced focus. He didn't look at them. He never did. Ethan grabbed Brandon by the front of his GI, dragging him in close. "Your daddy teach you how to take a hit?" he hissed. "'Cause you're going to get a lot of practice." Brandon swung clumsily, but Ethan twisted his arm and shoved him away, sending him stumbling into another group. "Hey, watch where you're going," another student snapped. Brandon steadied himself, sucking in air, trying to ignore the heat in his cheeks. Across the room, he saw Brian on the ground again, clutching his side while Colin stood over him, smirking. "You kids should stick to something you're good at," Colin jeered. "Like running track or shining shoes." A few students laughed, though some glanced nervously at Mason. The sensei remained focused on the other group, his voice calm and teacherly as he corrected a white belt's footwork. Brandon felt something inside him crack, a thin line of patience fraying under the weight of insult and pain. His father's voice rose in his head. "You boys learning to fight or learning to take a beating?" He surged forward, throwing a wild punch at Ethan's face. Ethan caught his wrist, twisted, and slammed an elbow into Brandon's shoulder. Brandon cried out as pain shot down his arm. "That all you got?" Ethan taunted. "Enough," Mason finally called, looking up. "Switch partners." Ethan leaned in close. "We're not done," he whispered, "not by a long shot." Brandon limped back to Brian, who was gingerly testing his ribs. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. They both knew the unspoken truth hanging between them like a curse. The dojo wasn't just a place to train, it was a battlefield, and they were losing. When class ended, they changed in silence. Brandon kept his head down, wincing as he pulled on his sweatshirt over bruised skin. Brian's eyes were red, but no tears fell. They walked out into the cool night air, their father waiting by the truck with the same tired eyes, the same calloused hands. "How was it?" he asked, his voice rough. "Fine," Brian lied. Henry studied them, seeing the bruises, the limp, the blood at the corner of Brandon's mouth. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. On the drive home, the twins sat shoulder to shoulder in the back seat, watching the darkened streets slip past. They felt small, cornered, stripped of every ounce of confidence they'd walked in with just days ago. That night, lying in their twin beds in their small room, Brandon whispered into the darkness. "I'm not sure I can do this," he said. Brian didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was soft, like a prayer. "We can't let them win," he said. "We can't." Brandon turned over, staring at the ceiling where the glow of the street lamp filtered through the blinds. "I'm scared, Bri," he confessed. "I know," Brian said. "Me too." In the room across the hall, Henry lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling paint, fists clenching and unclenching on the blanket. He'd seen the fear in his son's eyes. He knew that look. He'd seen it in young soldiers fresh out of boot camp, men who'd been taught discipline but never learned how to survive when the bullets started flying. He'd told himself the dojo would toughen them up, teach them to stand tall. But now he wasn't so sure. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Henry's gut churned with a feeling he hadn't had since the deserts of Iraq. A rising certainty that a storm was coming. And if he didn't act soon, his boys would be broken before they ever learned to fight back. In the weeks that followed, the pattern continued. Ethan and Colin targeted the twins relentlessly, calling them slurs when Mason wasn't looking, tripping them in line, cornering them in sparring and pushing them to the breaking point. Other students turned away, their silence complicit. And Sensei Mason, he just kept walking past, his voice calm, his gaze empty. Brandon's bruises deepened. Brian's eyes grew hollow. But every night as they lay in the dark, they whispered to each other the same promise. We don't quit. We don't break. They didn't know yet how much they'd have to sacrifice to keep that promise, or what they'd become when the breaking point finally came. The bruises started to blend together after the first month, purple fading to yellow, then blooming purple again over bone and muscle barely healed from the last beating. Brandon and Brian Carter learned to move carefully, to wince silently when climbing the school bus steps, to lie smoothly when teachers asked about the scrapes and limps they carried like hidden badges of shame. Inside the Iron Path Karate Academy, the air seemed thicker now. Every class a gauntlet they endured rather than a place of learning. Ethan Myers and Colin Brooks had grown bolder with each passing week, their insults sharpening into knives aimed directly at the twins' skin and spirit. "Look at you," Ethan whispered one evening as they lined up for drills, his voice pitched low so Sensei Mason wouldn't hear. "Still here? Thought you'd have quit by now. Guess even animals can be stubborn." Colin chuckled, stepping behind Brian and bumping his heel, sending him stumbling into Brandon. "Careful," he drawled. "Don't want your monkey brother falling on you." Brian caught himself, his face pale with fury, but he said nothing. They'd learned early that answering back only earned them harder hits and louder taunts. Hey! That night, the dojo reeked of sweat and tension. The mirrors lining the walls reflected every movement. The bright overhead lights glinting off polished wood floors that seemed as indifferent to their suffering as Sensei Mason himself. He moved through the class with practiced authority, praising the older black belts, correcting the occasional white belt, but ignoring the brutal sparring happening at the edges of his peripheral vision. "Today, we focus on endurance," Mason announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Partner drills, 3-minute rounds, rotate after each round." Brandon's stomach twisted. He already knew how this would go. As they shuffled into pairs, Ethan and Colin made sure the twins ended up facing them. They bowed quickly, that sneer never leaving Ethan's face. "Remember," Mason said, not looking at them, "light contact only. Control. Discipline." Ethan lunged before Mason had finished speaking. Brandon tried to step back, but Ethan's foot hooked around his ankle, sending him crashing to the mat. "Oops," Ethan said as Brandon scrambled up, the smirk never leaving his face. "You gotta stay on your feet, rookie." The next blow was a sweeping kick aimed high. Brandon ducked, but not fast enough. The edge of Ethan's foot caught him in the ear, sending ringing pain shooting through his skull. "Where's your guard, monkey?" Ethan hissed. "Can't even keep your head up?" Across the mat, Colin slammed a punch into Brian's ribs, making him grunt and stagger. Brian tried to counter with a clumsy hook, but Colin easily blocked it, sweeping Brian's legs out and slamming him onto his back so hard the floor rattled. "Stay down," Colin snapped, his face inches from Brian's. "You don't belong here." A few other students paused to look, but no one stepped in. No one ever did. And Sensei Mason. He'd already turned his back, watching a group of brown belts practicing forms near the windows, his arms folded over his chest, his face a mask of calm indifference. Brandon struggled to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision spotted with bursts of white light. He blinked hard, trying to clear his head, but Ethan was already moving again, throwing a quick jab that connected with his temple and sent him reeling. "Pathetic," Ethan sneered. "I barely touched you." "Switch!" Mason barked from across the room. The twins limped away, clutching their bruises, barely able to stand upright as they lined up again. On the walk home, the night air was cool, but it couldn't wash away the stench of sweat and humiliation clinging to their skin. Their father was waiting at the curb, the old truck idling with a soft rumble. He said nothing as they climbed into the back seat, but Brandon saw the way his father's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel when he glanced at them in the rearview mirror. "Everything go all right?" Henry asked finally, voice neutral. "Yeah, Dad," Brian said softly. "We're learning." Henry didn't answer, but Brandon could almost hear the gears grinding in his father's skull, the old soldier reading the truth in their split lips and blackened eyes. At home, they showered in silence. Brian moved slowly, one hand pressed to his ribs as he winced with each breath. "It's getting worse," Brandon muttered as he dried his face with a threadbare towel. "I know," Brian whispered, staring at the cracked tile of the bathroom wall. We keep going." Brandon wanted to scream. Instead, he nodded, forcing the anger down into the pit of his stomach where it boiled and churned like hot tar. The next week brought no relief. If anything, Ethan and Colin seemed to sense how close the twins were to breaking, and they savored it. During warm-ups, Ethan tripped Brandon repeatedly, chuckling as Brandon struggled to keep his balance. Colin accidentally elbowed Brian in the ribs during line drills, muttering under his breath, "Don't drop so fast, weakling." One evening, while the twins sat tying their belts before class, Ethan sauntered over with Colin at his side. He squatted down in front of Brandon, his pale blue eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Hey, Carter," he drawled, using Brandon's last name like a slur. "How's the view from down there? Still thinking you can hack it here?" Brandon clenched his jaw. "Go away, Ethan," he said softly. Ethan's grin widened. "Or what?" He shoved Brandon's shoulder, making him tumble backward. "You gonna cry to Sensei Mason? Maybe cry to your daddy?" Brandon's hands curled into fists, his vision going red. But Brian grabbed his wrist, squeezing tight. A silent plea. "Don't. Not yet." "Yeah," Colin said, looking down at Brian. "Listen to your brother, monkey. He's the smart one." They sauntered away, laughing, high-fiving each other as they joined the other black belts at the front of the room. Class that night was a blur of pain. Ethan and Colin maneuvered the rotation so they sparred with the twins again. Each blow landed with precision, the older boys careful never to hit hard enough to draw blood or leave evidence too obvious, but hard enough to hurt, hard enough to humiliate. "Maybe your daddy should have stuck to fixing trucks," Colin muttered as he slammed a punch into Brian's gut. "That's all you people are good for anyway." Brandon's breath caught in his throat as he saw Brian drop to one knee, gasping. He charged Ethan, landing a wild, sloppy punch against the side of Ethan's head. For one bright moment, Ethan's eyes widened in shock. Then he grinned, a cold, toothy expression that made Brandon's blood run cold. "You want to play rough?" Ethan snarled. He slammed his elbow into Brandon's collarbone, making him scream. Brandon staggered back, clutching his shoulder, tears springing to his eyes. "Enough!" Mason snapped, finally looking their way. "Control yourselves. Switch partners." Brandon bent double, panting, clutching his shoulder. Brian limped over, his face pale. "We can't keep doing this," Brandon hissed. Brian swallowed, nodding. "We can't quit either," he whispered. They staggered through the rest of the class, every second a test of endurance that left them trembling and soaked in sweat. When it was finally over, they gathered their gear with numb fingers, the laughter of Ethan and Colin ringing in their ears like gunfire. Outside, Henry waited by the truck. His eyes narrowed as they approached, noting their limps, the way Brandon clutched his shoulder. "Get in," he said shortly. The drive home was silent. Henry didn't ask questions. The old soldier was building something inside himself. A slow burn that Brandon could almost feel radiating off the front seat like heat from an engine left running too long. That night, Brandon lay awake, listening to Brian's ragged breathing in the next bed. The pain in his shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat. "I hate them," he whispered into the dark. Brian didn't answer, but in the silence, Brandon heard the shift of blankets, felt the anger radiating off his brother like waves of heat. Something had to change. Neither of them knew how yet, but deep in their bones, they both sensed the same thing. Ethan and Colin wouldn't stop until they were broken, unless the twins found a way to break the cycle first. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Henry moved past their door, his silhouette briefly visible in the sliver of hallway light. He paused, his shadow lingering, then moved on. Brandon stared at the ceiling, his teeth grinding together. He was tired of bleeding, tired of hiding. He didn't know it yet, but his father was reaching the same conclusion in the room across the hall. The twins had learned endurance. Now it was time to learn something else. Something darker, something necessary. Because sometimes surviving meant becoming the very thing the enemy feared in the first place. Brandon lay in the dark, the dull throb in his shoulder pulsing with each tick of the old clock on the nightstand. The house was quiet except for the groan of the furnace kicking on and the faint creak of the hallway floorboards as their father moved from room to room, checking locks, peering out windows as if expecting trouble to come slinking up the front steps. Brian breathed in ragged pulls across the narrow room, every inhale like a small gasp of pain. His ribs were bruised again, purple-black under the bandage Henry had wrapped there with careful hands and clenched jaw. "Bri," Brandon whispered, breaking the silence that had pressed them both flat into their beds for over an hour. "Yeah?" Brian croaked. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Brian was quiet so long that Brandon almost thought he'd fallen asleep. Then came a faint rustle of blankets and Brian's voice, thin but hard as a blade. "They want us to break," Brian said. "If we quit, if we give up, they win." "I know," Brandon whispered. He hated the tremor in his own voice, but it's like every time I try to hit back, it just makes them worse. "Yeah," Brian breathed. "But if we stop trying, it makes them worse too." Brandon turned his head toward his brother's bed, though he couldn't see him in the dark. "So, what do we do?" Brian didn't answer, but in that silence, Brandon felt something shift. It wasn't defeat, it wasn't fear, it was resolve. A quiet, cold determination that filled the cracks where their hope had been ground to dust. Across the hallway, Henry Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faded oak surface like it was an enemy he needed to outflank. His work boots sat by the back door, dust still clinging to the cracked leather. He hadn't even bothered to take off his heavy flannel jacket, the collar turned up against the chill that seemed to seep through the walls no matter how high they set the thermostat. On the table in front of him lay the twins' battered sparring gloves, the seam torn on one, a splotch of dried blood on the other. He traced the split seam with a calloused finger, jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped under his beard. He'd been patient. He'd told himself the dojo would build character, that his sons needed to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. That part of growing up was figuring out how to take a hit and keep moving. But every night they came home more battered, more silent, more hollowed out. He knew the look in their eyes. He'd seen it overseas in green young soldiers who'd walked into the fire, and realized too late there was no help coming. And he remembered the first hard lesson he'd learned, alone in a dusty alley, blood running into his boot, a rifle jammed in his hands. Sometimes no help was coming. Sometimes you had to become the help yourself. He reached under the table and pulled out an old duffel bag. The canvas faded to gray, the zipper half rusted. His hands moved by habit, laying out the contents with quiet precision. A roll of hand wraps, a pair of battered focus mitts, a leather jump rope with cracked handles, and, at the bottom, a coiled belt of soft black cotton, worn smooth by years of sweat and grit. He set the belt on the table and stared at it. Then he picked up the focus mitts and turned them over in his hands. The house was so quiet he could hear the twins' muffled voices through the floor vent, the raw edge of fear in Brandon's voice, the iron in Brian's. He stood up slowly, the chair scraping back across the linoleum with a creak that made the dog lift its head in the corner, ears twitching. Henry ignored it. He moved to the garage door, flipped on the light and surveyed the cluttered space. Boxes of old tools, cans of half-used paint, the battered workbench stained with oil and sawdust. He'd spent years turning this garage into a shelter, a place to fix things, build things, create something from nothing. But tonight, he saw it for what it really was. A battleground. He moved the boxes to the walls, clearing a patch of concrete floor. Then he hoisted the old heavy bag out of the corner, the chain groaning as he attached it to the steel hook in the ceiling beam. He tested it twice, giving it a hard shove. The chain held. Then he walked back inside, leaving the garage light burning behind him. The next afternoon, when the twins trudged home from the dojo, their faces pale and shoulders slumped, Henry was waiting at the door. "Drop your bags," he said, voice low and steady. Brandon froze in the doorway, one hand clutching the strap of his backpack. "Dad, drop 'em," Henry repeated. They obeyed. "Out to the garage," Henry said. Brian's eyes darted to Brandon, a silent question flickering in the space between them, but neither argued. They followed their father through the kitchen, past the scuffed linoleum that creaked under his boots, into the garage. The bright bulb overhead threw stark shadows across the cement floor, and the old heavy bag swaying gently from its chain. "Take off your coats," Henry said. "Dad, we got homework," Brandon started. "Take off your coats." His voice wasn't loud, but it was like iron scraping on iron. The twins obeyed. Henry tossed them each a roll of cloth hand wraps. "Put these on, watch me." They fumbled with the wraps, trying to mimic the quick, precise loops their father made around his own broad knuckles. Henry nodded once, satisfied. "Good enough, now listen." He stepped up to the heavy bag and threw a quick, brutal jab that rocked it on its chain. The slap of leather on leather echoed in the cold space. "I let that dojo run its course," he said, breathing hard. "I told myself it was part of learning, but that's done. I'm teaching you now." Brian swallowed. "But Sensei says," Henry cut him off with a glare. "Sensei doesn't give a damn about you," he growled. "That man stands 10 feet away while those punks turn you into punching bags. That ends tonight." Brandon's mouth went dry. Are we quitting the dojo?" Henry shook his head slowly. "Number? You're gonna keep going. You're gonna smile and nod and take every shot they throw at you. But here..." He slammed another punch into the bag, sweat popping on his brow. "Here, you learn how to fight for real." Brian flinched as the bag shuddered. "Dad, we don't want to hurt anyone." Henry's laugh was short and humorless. "That's not your choice, son. Those boys made their choice. They come at you with bad intent, you end it quick, fast, clean, final." Brandon shivered. "But Sensei doesn't live in this house," Henry snapped. "I do, and I say you learn to fight back." He pointed at the bag. "Now hit." The twins looked at each other, then at their father, then at the bag. Brandon stepped up first, throwing a clumsy jab that glanced off the side. "Again," Henry barked. Brandon punched again, harder, his knuckles stinging even through the wrap. "Faster," Henry growled. "You don't wait for permission. You don't wait for the bell. Out there." He jabbed a finger toward the wall as if the dojo lay just beyond it. "They've got rules. In here, you learn how to break them. Hit harder." Brandon's breath came ragged, sweat dripping from his hairline as he threw punch after punch. Brian joined in, the sound of fists slamming into leather filling the garage like a war drum. Henry circled them, correcting their stance, showing them how to throw a knee, how to twist a wrist to break a hold, how to snap an elbow into soft tissue. "You never start a fight," he told them between drills, "but you damn well finish it. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," they panted together, their voices thin but fierce. When the session finally ended, their hands were raw and swollen, their arms trembling with exhaustion. Henry pulled them into a rough hug, sweat soaking through his flannel shirt. "You're my boys," he whispered fiercely. "Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to break you but me." In the weeks that followed, the garage became a refuge and a forge. The air thick with the smell of sweat and leather, the sound of fists on the heavy bag echoing into the cold night. At the dojo, they kept their heads down, endured the taunts and cheap shots, but at home, they grew harder, faster, smarter. They learned where the human body broke, where the nerves were softest, where pain could be inflicted with precision. And in the quiet hours before sleep, Brandon and Brian whispered in the dark, the same mantra burning in their chests. "We don't quit, we don't break, we endure, until it's time to strike." Their father had given them something the dojo never could. Not just training, but permission. Permission to stand up, permission to fight back, permission to survive. They didn't know when the day would come that they'd need to use what they were learning. But they both knew one thing for certain. When that day came, they wouldn't hesitate. And God help anyone who stood in their way. The garage became their sanctuary, a cold, concrete space lit by a single bare bulb that swung slightly in the draft from the old door. Henry Carter turned that room into a proving ground, the place where boys became men, where weakness burned away under the relentless pounding of fists and the crack of heavy pads. Every night, after homework was done and dishes were cleared from the dinner table, Brandon and Brian slipped quietly into the garage. Their mother, tired from her shift at the hospital, often went to bed early, trusting her husband's curt reassurance that the boys were working on something for school. She never asked questions, and Henry never offered answers. "Wrap your hands," Henry said one night, his voice low but hard. He watched with a soldier's cold precision as his sons looped the cloth around knuckles already scarred and raw from weeks of secret training. When they fumbled a fold or tied the wrap too loose, he snatched the cloth away and made them start over. "Out there," he said, jerking his chin toward the world beyond the garage door. "You get one chance to do it right. Mess it up, you bleed out before you learn your lesson." The boys learned quickly. Pain was an unforgiving teacher, but it taught the truth better than any book or belt test. They started with basics. Punches thrown into the heavy bag until the chain creaked, sweat pooling on the cracked concrete floor. Then came footwork drills, dodging Henry's swinging focus mitts as he barked commands. He moved like a predator even at 50, his old injuries slowing him only slightly, eyes sharp and voice steady. "Plant your foot before you throw," he snapped at Brian when his punch landed sloppy. "You want to hit a man hard enough to drop him? Set your base first, otherwise you're swatting flies." Brandon felt every correction like a lash, but he didn't complain. He watched his father's stance, mimicked the angle of his hips, the snap of his shoulders. Brian learned too, quieter but no less fierce. his normally calm face set in grim concentration. Outside the garage, the nights grew colder, frost creeping along the bottom edges of the window glass. But inside, the boys sweat and grunted, their arms shaking from exhaustion, their hearts pounding so loud they could barely hear Henry's voice over the roar of blood in their ears. "Again!" Henry barked. Brandon's knuckles split on the leather bag, blood spotting the surface. He hissed through his teeth but didn't stop. Henry only nodded, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. "You don't quit?" he said, his voice low so only they could hear. "That's how they win. They want you scared, soft, looking for someone to save you. But you ain't kids anymore. Out there," he jabbed a finger at the wall, "you're alone. You break them before they break you." Between sets, Henry drilled them on anatomy, showing them diagrams from an old combat manual he'd kept from the army. "See this?" he said, tapping the illustration of a skeletal figure with his thick finger. "Solar plexus. Hit here. You knock the wind out of a man. He can't breathe, can't think." He flipped the page. "Here, side of the neck. You smash him there, he drops or goes blind for just long enough to finish the job." Brian stared at the pages with wide eyes. "Dad, that's not like what they teach at the dojo." Henry grunted. "Those people care about tournaments, trophies, how pretty your stance looks. That's all for show. I'm not teaching you to win medals. I'm teaching you how to stay alive." Some nights, they sparred with Henry himself. He wore old padded gloves, but he didn't pull punches. He wanted them to feel what real force was, to learn how to take a hit and keep moving. Brandon bled from the nose twice that way. Brian, more cautious, but still coming away with a fat lip and bruised cheek. Henry never apologized. He only helped them clean the blood, then pushed them back into position. "You think those punks at the dojo will be careful with you?" he growled one night, slamming a mitt against Brandon's guard so hard it rattled his teeth. "They're gonna come at you like dogs. I'm teaching you how to send 'em back crawling." At first, the twins thought of quitting every night. Their muscles screamed in agony, their bruises layered so deep they felt like they could barely lift their arms at school the next day. But something else kept them coming back, the spark of anger they saw in each other's eyes, the tiny ember of pride that burned a little hotter every time they landed a clean punch, every time Henry gave them a brief nod of satisfaction. They started noticing things at the dojo too. The patterns. The way Ethan dropped his left hand when he threw a right hook. The habit Colin had of shifting his weight forward before every leg sweep. Little tells that Henry had taught them to look for. "You learn your enemy," Henry said, breath steaming in the cold air as they stretched. "That's how you win. You take away his advantages, you use his own strength against him." Brandon started studying Ethan's stance like a hawk. He memorized the rhythm of Ethan's steps, the little hitch in his breath when he got cocky. Brian kept mental notes on Colin's timing, watching every sparring session with silent intensity, his eyes never blinking when Colin moved. At school, they still kept their heads down, but inside, they felt different. They weren't the same battered kids who limped home every evening and lay awake in the dark, wondering if they'd survive the next class. They were sharpening themselves like blades, building something under the surface that no one could see. They started practicing in secret during lunch breaks, out behind the old gym building where the grass grew high, and no teachers bothered them. They threw short combos, working the same strikes over and over until their arms ached. "Again," Brandon would grunt, sweat dripping off his chin. "Again," Brian would echo, his voice flat but steady. Ethan and Colin noticed the change, though they didn't understand it. They still mocked them, still tripped them in line, still slammed elbows into their ribs during drills. But there was hesitation now, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes when Brandon didn't flinch at the taunts. when Brian stood up a little straighter after every blow. One evening, as they were leaving the dojo, Ethan cornered them by the lockers. His grin was sharp, but his eyes flicked nervously between the two brothers. "You two think you're tough now?" he sneered, voice pitched low so Sensei wouldn't hear. "Don't think we don't see you getting all big and brave, but let me tell you something. When we break you in front of everyone, they're all gonna know what you really are." Brandon felt the old fear rise in his chest, but something else burned hotter, drowning it out. "You can try," he said softly, meeting Ethan's eyes. Ethan froze, thrown off by the calm in Brandon's voice. Brian stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not quitting." Ethan opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, but Colin tugged his sleeve, shooting a nervous glance over his shoulder. They backed off, muttering curses, but the threat in their voices sounded hollow. That night, the garage felt warmer somehow. Henry put them through new drills, quick bursts of strikes followed by rapid retreats, showing them how to shift direction mid-attack, how to duck low and come up swinging. "You don't stand there and trade," he barked. "You're not bigger than them, you're not stronger, but you're going to be smarter, faster, and meaner." They learned how to feint with the left and pivot to the right, how to slip a punch and counter with a hook to the ribs, how to stomp on a foot to break balance and come in with an elbow to the temple. "Brutal," Brian muttered one night, breathless after a long set. Henry snorted. "This ain't a sport, boy, this is survival." At the dojo, the twins kept up the charade, dropping their eyes when Ethan or Colin approached, taking the hits, absorbing the taunts. But inside, they were coiled springs, waiting for the right moment. In the dark, lying in their beds, Brandon whispered across the room. "We're ready," he said. "Almost," Brian whispered back. "Almost." Henry listened from the hallway, the old floorboards cool under his bare feet. His boys didn't see the tears that burned in his eyes, or the proud, hollow ache in his chest. He had trained soldiers before, sent them out into a world that broke them or hardened them into killers. Now, he was sending his sons into a war he couldn't fight for them. But he'd given them the tools, and when the day came, they'd stand or fall on their own. That night, the heavy bag in the garage swung gently in the cold air, stained with sweat and blood. The boys slept in their beds, muscles twitching in exhausted dreams, their breath steady. The war hadn't come yet, but it was coming. And this time, they would be ready. The decision came one bitterly cold night, the air in the garage so sharp it bit at their lungs with every breath. Brandon had just finished a punishing set of strikes on the heavy bag, sweat pouring down his temples despite the chill, his knuckles raw and throbbing. Brian stood nearby, massaging his aching forearms, watching their father pace the floor like a caged wolf. Henry Carter had been quieter than usual that night, his eyes far away, lips pressed into a thin line. He'd watched every punch, every slip and pivot, correcting small mistakes with quick, sharp words. But now he seemed distracted, almost coiled in on himself, like something was brewing behind that granite stare. "Take a knee," he finally said, his voice rough. The twins sank to the cold cement floor, breathing hard, hearts still pounding from the last drill. Henry leaned against the workbench, crossing his thick arms over his chest, the old scars on his knuckles pale under the harsh light. "You boys been training hard," he said. "Harder than anyone your age should have to." Brandon swallowed, the taste of blood still fresh in his mouth. Brian said nothing, just watched their father with wary eyes. "I told myself," Henry continued, his voice low, "that maybe it would end on its own, that those punks at that dojo would get bored, move on, find someone else to chew up and spit out. But I was wrong. Brandon and Brian glanced at each other, silent understanding passing between them. They'd known it too, known Ethan and Colin wouldn't stop until something forced their hand. Henry turned away for a moment, staring at the battered heavy bag swaying gently from the chain. His voice dropped to a growl. They're going to keep coming. They're going to keep pushing you until they break you in front of everyone. Unless you show 'em, you won't break. Unless you make 'em afraid of you. Brian's breath hitched. Dad, what are you saying? Henry looked back at them, eyes dark and hard. I'm saying there's a tournament in 3 weeks, the Tri-County Open. Anyone can enter. The Open Division puts you against anyone, no matter their belt rank. Black belts, red belts, doesn't matter. I'm saying you boys are ready. Brandon felt his stomach lurch. Ready? He echoed, voice faint. Henry nodded once. Ready to show them what you've been learning out here, show everyone they can't humiliate you anymore. Brian frowned. But they'll be in the tournament too, he whispered. Ethan and Colin, they'll be in the black belt division. The Open Division isn't about belts, Henry said. It's about skill, about guts. If you want to face those boys, face them fair and square with no excuses, this is how you do it. You step into that ring and you beat them where everyone can see. Silence settled over the garage like a blanket of snow. Brandon could hear the slow drip of condensation from the rafters, the faint creak of the chain overhead. We could get hurt, Brandon said softly. Really hurt. Henry didn't flinch. Yeah, you could. We could lose, Brian whispered. Henry's jaw tightened. You could, but you won't. Brandon rubbed a shaking hand over his eyes. He thought of Ethan's grin, the way he whispered slurs under his breath. Thought of Colin's smirk, the crack of fists on bone, the way Sensei Mason looked away every time they took another beating. He thought of their mother, smiling tiredly over the kitchen table, trusting they were learning something good and honest at that dojo. Why now? Brandon asked. Why the tournament? Henry blew out a long breath, like a man steadying himself before a fight. Because I saw something in you boys last week, he said. When Ethan cornered you at the lockers, you didn't flinch. You didn't back down, you're ready. And because I can't fight this fight for you. If I go in there and break those boys in half, it won't teach them anything. Won't teach the world anything. But if you do it, if you stand up and prove what you're made of, nobody will ever look at you the same way again. Brian shivered. What if we're not ready? Henry knelt so he was eye level with them. His voice softened. You've been fighting for weeks, boys, taking hits that would drop grown men, learning to bleed and keep going. That's ready enough. And I'll be in your corner every step of the way. Brandon felt a small spark flare in his chest, bright and hot. A sliver of pride, sharp enough to cut through the fear. What do we have to do? He whispered. Henry grinned, a fierce baring of teeth. First, we get you registered. Tomorrow before school we're going down to the rec center and putting your names on the list. After that, we train like hell. Brian licked his lips. And Mom? Henry's grin faded. He glanced over his shoulder at the kitchen door, as if he could see her asleep in the bedroom just beyond. Your mother doesn't need to know the details, he said quietly. Not yet. She'd try to stop this, and I don't blame her. But she's not the one standing in that ring. You are. And you need this. The boys were quiet, absorbing the weight of what was coming. Henry clapped a hand on each of their shoulders, his grip strong. Sleep tonight, you'll need it, because starting tomorrow, we're gonna work like dogs until you're ready to face anyone they put in front of you. The next morning, the cold sun barely above the rooftops, Henry drove the twins to the community center where the tournament registration was held. The gym smelled of floor wax and old sweat, banners from local dojos hanging limp against the walls. A bored clerk behind a folding table flipped through papers, glancing at the boys with mild disinterest. "You boys sure you want the open division?" she asked, pen poised. "That puts you against anyone. Black belts, instructors, adults. Usually kids your age stick with the junior brackets." "We're sure," Brandon said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. Brian nodded, silent but resolute. The clerk shrugged, jotting down their names. "Suit yourselves. Ring assignments will be posted day of. Good luck." Henry signed the form, sliding over the registration fee in cash. As they turned to leave, he rested a hand on each of their shoulders. "No turning back now," he said. Brandon felt his heart slam in his chest. "We don't want to," he whispered. That night, training in the garage was more brutal than anything that had come before. Henry didn't hold back, working them until they could barely stand, sweat soaking through their shirts until steam rose off their bodies in the cold air. "You have 3 weeks," he growled, pacing back and forth. 3 weeks to build yourselves into the kind of fighters nobody sees coming. Fast, precise, relentless. I don't want you thinking about trophies. I want you thinking about ending every fight you step into, quick and hard. They drilled until their muscles locked up, until Brian vomited in the corner from the effort. Henry handed him a rag, waiting until he wiped his mouth before dragging him back onto the floor. "Again!" he snapped. Brandon's arms felt like lead, his knuckles bleeding through the wraps, but he threw punch after punch at the mitts until Henry nodded, satisfied. "That's what I want," Henry grunted. "That look in your eye, that's a fighter." At the dojo, Ethan and Colin continued their games, but the twins barely reacted. They took the hits, took the taunts, but their eyes were colder now, less fearful. A storm was brewing under their skin, and the older boy sensed it without understanding exactly what had changed. "Look at them," Ethan sneered one night as they left the locker room. "Dead inside. They'll break soon enough." Colin laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Yeah, they're just biding their time, thinking they can pull something. We'll shut that down fast." The twins heard it all, filing the words away like bullets into a magazine. 3 weeks wasn't long. It wasn't fair, but it was all they had, and when the day came, they would be ready. The day of the tournament dawned cold and bright, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the cracked parking lot of the Milltown Community Center. Brandon and Brian sat in the back seat of their father's old truck, their hands wrapped in fresh white tape, staring silently out the windows at the stream of cars pulling in, families and coaches unloading gear bags and chatting excitedly. Henry shut off the engine and turned to face them, his weathered hands resting on the back of the seat. His eyes were steady, calm as dark water before a storm. "You boys ready?" he asked. Brandon swallowed, his mouth dry. "Yes, sir." Brian nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. Henry looked at them for a long moment, then reached back and squeezed their shoulders. "Remember what I told you. Nobody hands you respect. You take it. Fast and hard before they know what hit 'em, understand?" "Yes, sir," they answered together. Inside, the gym buzzed with noise and nervous energy. Parents shuffled in bleachers, clapping hands on shoulders and offering last-minute advice. Competitors stretched and shadow-boxed, the air thick with the smell of sweat and chalk dust. Banners hung from the rafters, bright cloth in red, black, and white, each bearing the insignia of local dojos. The mat areas were marked off with duct tape, 3 rings set up across the polished wood floor. Brandon and Brian walked with Henry to the check-in table, the clerk handing them bout numbers and pointing them toward the staging area. As they moved through the crowd, Brandon caught sight of Ethan and Colin across the gym, standing with Sensei Mason and their parents near a cluster of black belts from the Iron Path dojo. Ethan spotted them and grinned, nudging Colin and whispering something that made both boys laugh. Mason glanced their way, his face tightening briefly before smoothing into polite indifference. "Stay focused," Henry murmured, steering his sons toward the warm-up area. "They'll try to rattle you. Don't give 'em the satisfaction." Brandon nodded, but his heart thudded painfully in his chest. He could feel the stares from the other students, older kids in black belts with polished trophies peeking out of their gear bags, their parents murmuring in low voices, glancing at the twins and whispering. He tried to block it out, focusing on the slow rhythm of his breath, the flex and clench of his fists. Across the room, a loudspeaker crackled to life, the announcer's voice echoing through the cavernous gym. "Open Division competitors report to Ring 2 for bout assignments." Henry squeezed Brandon's shoulder one last time. "You got this," he said, then stepped back, arms folded, eyes like steel. The first bout came fast, faster than Brandon had expected. A wiry teenager from another dojo, his black belt hanging loose around his waist, swaggered into the ring opposite him. Brandon heard his father's voice in his ear as he bowed, fast and hard. Before they know what hit him, the referee shouted, "Begin!" and the older boy lunged, throwing a wild front kick meant to knock Brandon off his feet. But Brandon slipped sideways, pivoting on his heel, just as Henry had drilled into him for weeks in the cold garage. He threw a hook into the boy's ribs, felt the air leave him in a grunt, then stepped in with a hard knee to the belly. The boy folded, gasping, and the referee threw his hand up. "Point, Carter!" the crowd murmured, surprised. The older boy staggered upright, glaring. Brandon ignored him, eyes locked on his father at the edge of the ring. Henry nodded once, his face a mask of quiet pride. The bout ended quickly after that, Brandon landing a clean cross to the solar plexus that dropped the boy to his knees. The referee declared him the winner, and Brandon stepped back, breathing hard, fighting to keep his hands steady as the adrenaline roared through his veins. He glanced across the ring area and saw Brian facing his own first opponent, a tall kid with a brown belt and a smirk on his face. The match began, and Brandon watched as Brian ducked under a high kick, stepped inside, and landed a quick, brutal uppercut to the boy's jaw that made the crowd gasp. Henry's voice echoed from the sidelines. "Finish it!" Brian did, slamming a hook into the boy's ribs that sent him sprawling. The referee called the bout, and Brian stepped back, chest heaving, eyes locked on his brother. They nodded to each other, one down. It went that way all morning. The twins worked their way through the bracket like blades through soft wood, their father's voice a steady anchor behind them. Ethan and Colin watched from across the gym, their smug grins fading with each victory the twins racked up, tension seeping into their posture like poison. "Those punks are getting lucky," Colin muttered at one point, his jaw tight. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Brandon, tracking every movement, every hit. By noon, the bracket had thinned, and the match pairings were inevitable. Brandon versus Ethan, Brian versus Colin. Henry's voice was low and steady as he spoke to his sons near the bleachers. "This is what we trained for. Everything we did in that garage leads here. Don't think about their words, or the crowd, or Sensei Mason. Just finish the fight." Brandon swallowed hard. His hand shook as he tied his belt tighter, the thin cotton damp with sweat. "Yes, sir," he whispered. The announcer called his name. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, whispers spreading like brush fire. "Isn't that the Carter kid, the yellow belt? Going up against Myers, kid's gonna get slaughtered." Brandon stepped into ring 2, the mat cold under his bare feet. Ethan was already there, bouncing on the balls of his feet, eyes glittering with malice. "You think you're something special?" Ethan hissed, loud enough for Brandon to hear. "I'm gonna break you in front of everyone. Show them what a pathetic piece of trash you really are." Brandon said nothing. He bowed stiffly, then settled into his stance, just like his father had taught him. Shoulders loose, feet planted, eyes locked on the target. The referee called, "Begin." Ethan came in fast, throwing a hook meant to take Brandon's head off. But Brandon slipped the punch, driving a jab into Ethan's ribs. He heard the grunt of pain, saw Ethan's eyes flash with surprise. Ethan swung again, wild and angry. Brandon ducked under it, pivoted, and landed a straight punch into Ethan's solar plexus, just like Henry had drilled him to do 1,000 times. Ethan stumbled back, gasping. The crowd murmured in shock. "Point, Carter!" the referee shouted. Brandon stayed on him, relentless. Ethan charged in, fury turning his movements sloppy, and Brandon exploited every gap, landing crisp, clean hits that rattled Ethan's jaw, snapped his head back, sent sweat spraying from his hair. By the final point, Ethan was reeling, eyes glassy, hands dropping lower with each passing second. Brandon slipped a lazy front kick, stepped in, and drove his elbow into Ethan's chest. Ethan hit the mat hard, gasping like a fish on a dock. "Match! Carter!" The crowd erupted, shocked murmurs rippling through the gym. Across the ring, Brian's match against Colin had just begun. Colin charged, fists swinging, but Brian had seen that rush 100 times in training. He sidestepped, pivoted, and smashed a hook into Colin's jaw that spun him around. Henry roared from the sidelines, "Finish him!" Brian did, stepping in and delivering a brutal knee to Colin's ribs that made him crumple like a sack of flour. "Match, Carter!" the referee shouted. The gym fell silent for a moment, everyone staring at the twins as they walked back to their father. Then the whispers began, buzzing like angry hornets. That wasn't normal. Those kids, they're supposed to be yellow belts. Did you see how fast they moved? They're sandbagging, cheating. Something's not right. Henry ignored it all, pulling his sons into a fierce hug, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it," he whispered. "You showed 'em. Now walk out of here with your heads high. Nobody can say you didn't earn this." But as they gathered their gear, the Iron Path crowd swarmed Sensei Mason, angry voices rising. Ethan and Colin's father stormed toward the tournament officials, red-faced and shouting accusations. "They're ringers," one bellowed. "They're cheating. They've been training in secret. Someone needs to disqualify them now." Mason's voice was tight, brittle with desperation. "I don't know what happened. They were barely holding their own last month. This isn't possible." But the officials shook their heads, pointing at the score sheets. Everything was clean. The victories stood. Brandon met Ethan's eyes across the mat, saw the hate boiling there, saw the promise of revenge. He didn't flinch. In that moment, he felt the old fear shrivel and die, replaced by something cold and fierce and unyielding. Nobody would ever break them again. The gym was still buzzing, the echoes of the twins' victories rippling through the crowd like the aftermath of a lightning strike. Parents murmured in tight circles, casting furtive glances at the Carters as they packed their gear by the bleachers. Ethan and Colin slumped in folding chairs across the gym, ice packs pressed to ribs and jaws, their eyes dark with humiliation and rage. Henry hovered near his sons. watchful as a wolf, his thick arms folded, boots planted like roots in the scuffed wood floor. He felt the tension crackling in the air, whispers that smelled of blood and retribution. "Dad," Brandon said softly, pulling at the tape on his knuckles. "They're not gonna let this go." Henry grunted. "Number they won't. That's what cowards do. Come at you when they think you're not looking." He shifted his weight, his eyes tracking Ethan's father, who paced near the tournament officials, voice low but sharp with accusation. The old soldier in him read the body language, the restless glances, the flickering hands. "They're plotting something," Henry said under his breath. "Keep your heads on a swivel." The twins nodded, their bodies humming with leftover adrenaline. The afternoon dragged on. Other bouts played out across the rings, matches that should have commanded cheers and gasps from the crowd, but instead drew only distracted applause as everyone kept sneaking glances at the Carters and the seething group from the Iron Path dojo. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the loudspeaker crackled. "Final exhibition match, Ring 1. Open Division Championship bout, Brandon Carter versus Ethan Myers." A hush fell over the gym, then a low murmur like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. Henry exhaled slowly. "This is it," he said. "Remember your training. You end this fast." Brandon swallowed, his stomach twisting, but he met his father's eyes and nodded. Brian clapped a hand on his brother's shoulder, his fingers warm and strong. "Get him," Brian said simply. They stepped into the ring, the mat cool under their bare feet, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. Across from Brandon, Ethan bounced lightly on his toes, grinning through the split in his swollen lip, his eyes gleaming with something wild and ugly. "You think you're special, monkey?" Ethan spat, his voice low. "You humiliated me once. You won't do it again. I'm going to hurt you so bad they'll never let you fight in this town again." Brandon felt the old fear rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, grinding it into dust under the heel of his will. He settled into his stance, loose and coiled, just like his father had taught him in the cold nights of the garage. The referee glanced between them, then raised his hand. "Fighters ready?" Brandon nodded once. Ethan sneered. "Begin!" Ethan charged, throwing a hook aimed at Brandon's temple. But Brandon had seen that move 1,000 times in training, had felt his father's mitt crash into his guard until his arms ached. He slipped the punch, pivoted, and slammed a hook into Ethan's exposed ribs. Ethan grunted, but he didn't back off. He lunged in again, head down, trying to drive Brandon back. Brandon sidestepped, sweeping Ethan's foot and sending him sprawling to the mat. The crowd gasped. Ethan scrambled up, red-faced and snarling, his eyes wild. He feinted high and threw a vicious kick at Brandon's knee, the kind of move that could cripple if it landed clean. But Brandon was faster. He jumped back just enough, then came in over the top with an elbow that cracked against Ethan's jaw. Blood spattered across the mat. "Point, Carter," the referee called, but the words barely registered. Ethan roared, charging again, fists swinging in wild arcs. Brandon blocked the first punch, slipped the second, and countered with a short, brutal hook that snapped Ethan's head sideways. Ethan staggered, shaking his head like a dazed bull, but came in again, fury overcoming any sense of strategy. Brandon saw the opening, the tiny hitch in Ethan's step, the drop of his guard on the left. He didn't hesitate. He lunged in, driving a knee into Ethan's belly, then hooked his arm and twisted, sending Ethan crashing to the mat so hard the whole ring shook. "Match! Carter!" But Ethan didn't stay down. He scrambled to his feet, blood running from his nose, his face twisted with hatred. "No!" he screamed, lunging at Brandon even as the referee tried to step between them. You think you're better than me? I'll kill you." The ring erupted in chaos. Parents screamed. Officials rushed forward. Henry vaulted the barrier, moving like a man 20 years younger, grabbing Ethan by the collar and yanking him back with a snarl. "Enough!" he roared, shoving Ethan into the arms of 2 officials. "You lost, boy. Take your beating and go home." Ethan struggled, spitting curses, but the officials dragged him away, his father yelling in the background about conspiracies and cheating. Brandon stood panting in the ring, blood spattered across his GI, his fists trembling from the surge of adrenaline. Across the mat, Brian climbed in, grabbing his brother's shoulders. "You did it," Brian whispered, his voice thick with awe. "You beat him." Brandon swallowed, the taste of copper and sweat thick on his tongue. "It's not over," he whispered back. "He'll come again. They all will." Henry reached them, pulling both boys into a rough embrace, his voice low and fierce. "Then you do the same thing every time. You show 'em they can't break you. You show 'em you fight." The crowd roared around them, some cheering, some shouting in anger and confusion. But in that moment, Brandon felt untouchable, stronger than he'd ever been in his life. Ethan's father was still bellowing at the officials, waving papers in the air, but the tournament director shook his head, pointing at the scoreboard. "Clean match," he shouted over the din. "The results stand. Anyone touches those boys again today, you're out of the circuit for good." Henry steered the twins out of the ring, toward the locker room. "We'll get cleaned up, get out of here," he muttered. "These people can stew in their own bile. You did what you came to do." Brian squeezed Brandon's shoulder again. "I knew you could beat him," he said, his voice fierce and proud. Brandon didn't answer. He was staring back at Ethan, who struggled in his father's grip, his eyes locked on Brandon with a hatred so deep it looked bottomless. "I think he'd kill me if he could," Brandon whispered. Henry snorted. "Let him try," he growled. "We'll be ready." In the locker room, Brian helped his brother peel off the bloody GI top, hissing as the fabric stuck to raw scrapes. Henry stood guard by the door, blocking the small knot of people who tried to push inside, demanding explanations, hurling accusations. "Tournament's over," he snarled at one red-faced father. "You want to file a complaint, go talk to the officials." "You think this is done?" the man spat. "Your punks humiliated my boy. This isn't over." Henry leaned in close, his breath hot and steady. "You want to take this outside, you can try, but I promise you, one of us is going to walk away, and it won't be you." The man blanched, backing off with a curse. Brian tied a clean t-shirt around Brandon's ribs where a nasty bruise was blooming purple and black. "Think they'll come at us in the parking lot?" he whispered. Henry snorted. "Let 'em. I'm ready." Outside, the sun was dipping behind the high school roofline, the shadows stretching long across the asphalt. Brandon and Brian moved carefully, sore and battered, their father flanking them like a silent sentinel. They reached the truck just as Ethan and his father burst out of the gym doors, a small mob trailing behind them. Ethan's father was shouting, waving papers in the air. "Cheaters!" he bellowed. "Sandbaggers, you rigged this whole thing." Ethan lunged at Brandon, but Henry stepped between them so fast the younger boy stumbled back, clutching his chest. "Touch my son again," Henry said softly, "and I'll show you what real fighting looks like." Ethan's father grabbed his son's shoulder, hauling him back. "This isn't over," he spat. "We'll see you again, Carter, and next time nobody will stop us." Henry grinned, sharp as a wolf. "We'll be waiting." He hustled the boys into the truck, slamming the door as angry shouts echoed through the parking lot. The engine roared to life and they pulled away, leaving the chaos behind them, the shadows swallowing the Iron Path crowd. Brandon sagged against the seat, eyes fluttering closed as exhaustion crashed through him. "You did it," Henry murmured, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "You beat them on their own turf, by their own rules. That's more than I ever did at your age." Brandon smiled faintly, his voice hoarse. "We're not done, Dad. They're coming." Henry's grin was all teeth. "I hope they do," he said, "because now you boys know how to fight back." The truck rumbled on into the night, the twins sitting shoulder to shoulder, bruised but unbroken, the taste of victory bitter and sweet in their mouths. Outside, the last rays of sun bled away into darkness, but inside the cab, the light burned bright. The weeks after the tournament passed like a fever dream. Brandon and Brian bore the bruises and aches of their victory as quietly as they'd borne the beatings that had come before. But this time, they carried something new inside them. A knowledge that they had fought back and won, against boys who had once seemed untouchable. Henry watched them with a mixture of pride and lingering worry. He kept the garage ready, the heavy bag hanging, the mats clean, but the boys came out there less and less. Not because they had grown lazy, but because they had nothing left to prove to each other. Word of what had happened at the tournament spread fast. Some whispered that the Carters had cheated, that they'd been secretly coached by a professional fighter. Others said it was a miracle. 2 kids standing up to the worst bullies in the circuit and beating them bloody, with the whole town watching. Ethan and Colin never came near the Carters again. Their fathers, humiliated and bitter, withdrew from the local martial arts scene, leaving the dojo in disarray. Sensei Mason closed his school within the month, the walls stripped of banners and trophies, the mats rolled up and hauled away in the back of a rusty moving truck. Meanwhile, Brandon and Brian found themselves in a strange, new place. Kids who had once mocked or ignored them now nodded in respect as they passed in the halls. Teachers seemed to look at them differently, as though they'd grown taller overnight. But the twins felt no triumph in it, only a deep, quiet relief that the war was over, at least for now. Henry sat them down one night at the kitchen table, the house dark and quiet around them. "You did what you had to do," he said, a voice low. "You proved you can stand up for yourselves. But listen to me. Violence leaves scars on you and everyone around you. Don't let it become the only way you solve problems." Brandon met his father's eyes. "We won't, Dad," he said softly. "But we're not afraid anymore. That's enough." Henry nodded slowly, eyes misty. "That's more than enough," he murmured. In the weeks that followed, the boys helped out around the house, fell back into their school routines, and spent more time just being brothers, playing video games, tossing a football in the yard, sitting on the porch as the sun went down. They knew Ethan's hate would never go away, that some people would hold grudges forever. But they also knew something else. They had each other. They had their father, and they had a bond forged in blood and sweat that nothing could break. In the end, it wasn't the victories on the mat that mattered most. It was the quiet confidence that came after, the knowledge that they could face whatever life threw at them and come out the other side standing, breathing, and ready to fight again if they had to. They didn't need trophies or medals to prove that. They carried the proof in their hearts and in the way they walked through the world with their heads high. Henry watched them one night, silhouetted against the fading sunset as they tossed a football back and forth across the lawn, their laughter ringing through the warm summer air. He felt something ease in his chest, a tension that had coiled there for years, finally beginning to unwind. "They're gonna be all right," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. they're gonna be just fine. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in rings or on mats. Sometimes they're fought in the quiet moments when you choose not to give in to fear, when you hold on to your dignity and your pride no matter what the world throws at you. And in those battles, the Carters had won something far greater than any championship. They had won their own freedom. Did this story inspire you as much as it did me? If you believe in standing up for what's right, if you've ever faced a bully or felt the odds stacked against you, I want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about a time you had to fight back, physically, emotionally, or in your own quiet way. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more powerful stories of courage, determination, and the human spirit. Together, let's build a community that believes in justice, strength, and never backing down.